Morgan Stanley CEO James Gorman has never shared this much about himself. From growing up in Australia to his annual fitness test to the historic rivalry with Goldman Sachs. Well, he has now. It's all in this month's Bloomberg Markets cover story. Bloomberg's Erik Schatzker spent hours interviewing Gorman for the piece, and he is with us now. Erik, I have to ask you, what surprised you most about this set of interviews with Gorman?
Well, Vonnie, here's what I would say. We like to think of these Wall Street CEOs in caricature, right? Masters of the universe, viciously competitive. That's what it takes to get to the top. But in Gorman's case, and I suspect it applies elsewhere too, what I discovered is that underneath all of that is a human being.
Yeah.
Right. So, for example, he's very competitive with himself when it comes to his annual fitness test, which you just mentioned. He's obsessed with the ergometer, and he isn't really interested in competing with anybody else. He's only competing with himself. He calls it his annual mark to market of his fitness. He told me about a time when, back in 2012, you may remember, Morgan Stanley was on the verge of not of collapse, but Moody's had threatened to downgrade Morgan Stanley by 3 notches. Mm-hmm. And he says that had Moody's actually gone ahead and downgraded them by 3 notches, they would have been out of business because they wouldn't be able to fund themselves. So he's in Russia when he finally gets the news that the downgrade was only 2 notches. So in other words, Morgan Stanley is still in business, and he's staring out the window, right? This lonely person with nobody to celebrate with, and he's kind of mentally communing with the guard whom he can see standing on the banks of the canal in St. Petersburg, and finally decides, God, goodness, I got to do something about this. So he goes downstairs and orders a glass of wine at the bar, and finally he subsequently tells me that the Morgan Stanley team in Russia finds out about this and comes to meet him at the bar, and they all sort of stay up a little bit late.
Yeah, I loved that story as well, because 2012 is not that long ago.
No.
And now Morgan Stanley is surprising everyone on the street, and he even says, if you look at fixed income, the irony is that could be our biggest winner in the next several years.
Well, people like to think that Morgan Stanley's fixed income franchise was dead, and if you go back only a couple of years, it did look like it was on life support. But he did what few other CEOs on Wall Street were prepared to do, which is cut his way to victory. And they reduced the risk-weighted assets in their fixed income business by something like 2/3. They sold off their commodities business. And in the short run, it did make them seem dramatically less competitive relative to Goldman Sachs, relative to JP Morgan, relative to Citigroup, relative to Bank of America. But look what happened in 2017. All of a sudden, Morgan Stanley was back in fixed income trading. The firm narrowed a historic gap in market cap between Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs. And if any firm on Wall Street looks like it's on a roll right now, it's Morgan Stanley.